If you're arriving in Bristol by train, then this is Temple Meads railway station. But back in Queen Victoria's time, Bristolians would have been more familiar with this building, the world's first railway terminus, built by Isambard Kingdom Brunel in 1841. And as a piece of industrial architecture, it's fabulous.
I'm on a journey along the route of the old Great Western Railway, in the tracks, so to speak, of the Victorian engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel. The scope of his work is staggering. Brunel's career is peppered with showpiece landmarks, such as the Royal Albert Bridge over the Tamar. But Devon and Cornwall lie ahead in my journey. I've now only got as far as Temple Meads in Bristol, a city that boasts more of Brunel's work than any other in Britain. The GWR was not just a means of transportation. For the great and the good of Bristol, it was a way of displaying the city's standing as an important trade centre. Brunel set out to design the finest station in the land. It would reflect the grand status of the GWR. But some of those who controlled the purse strings wanted his design to be simple, plain, and above all, cheap. However, Brunel's vision was of an extravagant Gothic fantasy in the style of an Elizabethan manor house.
He did his sums and pointed out that his Tudor design would only cost an extra £90. Well, eventually, the money men lost, and the station was built to Brunel's original Gothic design. 90 quid well spent, I'd say.
Brunel Station has been lovingly restored, and the space is devoted to commemorating the British Empire and Commonwealth.
Well, Gareth, you've done a great job of turning this into a wonderful museum, but very difficult for me to imagine what this would have been like in Brunel's day.
Well, we're standing in the engine shed, and we're walking between the pillars which show the width of the broad gauge. It's an astonishing building because this is the shed where the engines were watered, the ashes were raked out. Very different from other parts of the building, which is designed for passengers to enter into the building.
But Gareth, having come down here, how did they turn the trains around to go back up the line?
Well, when we built our small library at the end of this building, we discovered the foundations of the turntable, which is below the water tower, in which the water tank is still in place. And the trains were manually pushed around to come to the north side of the building to return back down to London.
If the engine house was strictly utilitarian, passengers arriving at Temple Meads were treated to something much more grandiose.
Well, I reckon this is pretty impressive, Gareth, by today's standards, but the Victorians coming in here for the first time must have been gobsmacked. I mean, it's doing it a disservice to call it a passenger shed.
Well, it is an extraordinary building. When it was built, it was the world's largest single-span building. And when they came in, the grandeur, the scale must have been breathtaking. What is remarkable about the building, it was one of the first buildings to think about how a railway would work, and that is what is special about this building. Originally, there was no glazing in the windows that we see alongside the platforms, but there wasn't enough throughput of air to allow the steam and smoke to disappear. So 2 years afterwards, they had to cut an opening in the apex of the roof to allow all the steam and smoke to escape.
So this is the boardroom, Gareth?
Well, this is where the Bristol board met and where Brunel would have to justify his expenditure and over-expenditure and being behind time. Nothing changes. But it's the earliest Great Western Railway office. It predates Paddington, and this is where the great man himself would have presented his plans.
Well, I think the fireplace is a good illustration of that, isn't it?
Most certainly. When we were investigating the history of the building and looking for plans of the site, we could see evidence of Brunel being forced, as he was being made to reduce his budget, to scale down what is a very grand fireplace today anyway.
It certainly is. No cigar butts found in that one.
No, I'm afraid not.
There's one area underneath the station that's no longer in daily use. Yet, in the days of steam, it was a hive of activity.
And here's another bit of underground Bristol few people get to see. The amazing vaulted cellars that Brunel built under his Bristol terminus. A place used to store coal for his locomotives. There were stables here for the horses that brought people and goods to and from the station. In fact, down here on the floor are the original hooks that horse saddles had been hung on. This particular device here, grade 1 listed. And over my head, there are openings in the ceiling here, and the locomotives would have been driven above them, and then they would have brushed out the clinker and ash from the engines on the trains, which would fall down here into carts to be taken away. It's all a bit spooky, really. You almost can feel Brunel here.
While we're in town, we must take a look at what was the Great Western Hotel. Not so much for the building's architecture, today only the facade remains, but for what it says about Brunel's great ambition to conquer the seas.
One day at a meeting of the CWR board, one of the directors present was commenting about the considerable length of the railway they were building. Brunel retorted with a bombshell of a new idea. Why not, he said, make it even longer? Build a steamship that would take it all the way from Bristol to New York, and call that the Great Western as well.
His idea was to offer a complete service from London to New York. Passengers would travel on the Great Western Railway to Bristol, stay in the luxury of the Great Western Hotel, then board the SS Great Western to steam across the Atlantic. It was an incredible idea, grand in vision and audacious in the extreme. So began Brunel's new career as designer of the greatest, most ambitious, most innovative steamships ever built. This is the Waverley, the last remaining sea-going paddle steamer in the world. She's recently undergone a £4 million refit and looks almost as good as the day she was built in 1947. She now earns her keep, giving mini cruises all around the British coast, like this one from Clevedon in the Bristol Channel. Back in the 19th century, in Brunel's time, paddle steamers were a common sight at coastal ports, but their size and engine efficiency severely restricted their range. Steam had been used on Atlantic crossings, but only in sailing boats fitted with an auxiliary engine. Most of the work was done by sail power. Brunel's service from London to Manhattan would require a steamship that could cross the Atlantic. For such a long passage, that demanded something much larger to carry enough coal.
But there were those who thought that such a ship would need to be so big it would be impossible to build, and impossible to find engines to put in it too. One of Brunel's chief critics, Dr. Dionysius Ludner, said one should just as easily talk about a journey from New York to the moon. Well, Brunel didn't take Ludner seriously. In fact, he thought he was a bit of a fool.
he wasn't a fool. I mean, too many historians, I think, have dismissed Lardner, a fool who was simply, you know, well, Brunel was obviously right and Lardner was obviously wrong. It's not quite as simple as that.
Lardner argued that small ships could barely carry enough coal to cross the Irish Sea. It was inconceivable that one could be built big enough to carry sufficient to cross the Atlantic. But Brunel knew better. It's all about water resistance. The bigger a ship gets, proportionately, the less the water resistance. Well, the maths are a bit complex, but Brunel understood them. He was one of the few that did.
Well, it's a matter of the proportions, and because Brunel knew his sums better, worked out how the proportions worked, he could see that the larger the ship, the less the total volume that had to be taken by the fuel. So if you wanted to go a long way, you need a bigger ship, and the further you went, the larger the ship, and you could do it, have a worthwhile cargo, provided you made the ship big enough.
Brunel's Great Western was the biggest ship the world had ever seen. She was a 26-foot oak-hulled paddle steamer displacing over 2,000 tons. On deck, she carried 4 masts and a single funnel. But after her maiden voyage to London to pick up passengers, on her return to Bristol, disaster struck, with potentially fatal consequences for Brunel himself.
Suddenly, the air filled with smoke, coming not from the top of the funnel, but from its base. Now, the stokers, the men whose job it was to put coal on the boilers, burst upon the deck, saw that they were close to land and promptly jumped overboard. Clearly, something was seriously wrong. What had happened was that lagging around the base of the funnel had caught fire. Captain Christopher Claxon, an old friend of Brunel's and fellow director, organised a party to man the water pumps and, brandishing a fire hose, entered the engine room to fight the blaze. Brunel tried to help too, but while he was climbing down a ladder, a badly charred rung gave way and he fell. Now, the fall would have severely injured him, but for the fact that he landed straight on top of Claxton. The captain was knocked to one side and Brunel fell face down into a pool of water, knocked unconscious. Well, Claxton had no idea who or what had hit him, but while he was recovering his senses, he did make out the shape of a body half submerged in water, seen through the dense smoke. Well, Claxton lifted the man's face out of the water so he wouldn't drown, and then arranged for his body to be heaved on deck by a rope. But it wasn't until the fire was put out that he actually realised the person he'd saved was Brunel himself.
The Great Western eventually sailed from Bristol on her maiden voyage to New York on the 8th of April 1838, completing the return voyage in record time. However, Brunel himself was not on board. He was busy building his next ship, which was to be bigger, faster, and have more innovations than anything else in the world. The SS Great Britain is one of Bristol's most popular attractions. When she was launched in 1843, she was one of the most important ships in the world, and historically, that's still true today. Not only was she the biggest ever built, at over 3,500 tons, dwarfing the Great Western, she was also the most radical. The first steam-powered, iron-hulled, propeller-driven, ocean-going passenger ship, the forerunner of all modern ships. She is a unique survivor from Victorian times, and under the superintendence of Brunel and his colleagues from the Great Western Steamship Company, she was built in the very dry dock she resides in today.
The Great Britain didn't quite turn out the way Brunel had originally intended. When he'd set out to design a sister ship to the Great Western, it was to have been of similar shape and size, a wooden-hulled paddle steamer. But along the way, Brunel's eye was caught by one or two technical innovations that were going to radically alter the design. If the Great Western had a heart of oak, the Great Britain was going to have a heart of iron.
The decision to build in iron was bold but not entirely new. A ship called Rainbow had visited Bristol in 1838. She had a revolutionary iron hull. Brunel and Captain Claxton were won over by the new material and could see the advantages that iron could bring.
Brunel had worked out that to build a ship the size of the Great Britain in wood would have meant the hull being about 2 feet thick. Done in iron, that thickness would have been reduced to just 2.5 inches, leaving plenty of room on board for the massive engines and the hundreds of tons of coal needed to make those transatlantic crossings.
So the Great Britain was to be iron-hulled and the biggest paddle steamer the world had seen. Well, that was the plan until something else caught Brunel's eye. Paddles are not a particularly efficient way of powering a ship. About a year after work had begun, the Archimedes sailed into Bristol. She was driven not by paddles, but by a newfangled thing called a propeller. Brunel was impressed by her speed. He chartered the Archimedes to conduct his own tests while ordering work to be stopped on the Great Britain. A propeller would enable a reduction in a hull's width and weight. Great Britain's design was fundamentally changed to fit her with a massive single screw.
Absolutely cutting edge, absolutely new, yes. But they're not, they weren't Brunel's ideas. He was assimilating other people's good ideas, showing how they could work, put them into practice.
In July 1843, thousands of Bristolians cheered the launch of the world's largest steam-powered, iron-hulled, propeller-driven ship. So began her transatlantic career. But the Great Britain's story is one of success mixed with disaster. There were damaged propellers, and she ran aground twice. After losing the Great Western Company a fortune, she was eventually sold for a pittance and spent 24 years carrying cargo to Australia. In 1866, she was rounding Cape Horn when her cargo caught fire, forcing her to put into the Falkland Isles. There, the old hulk was condemned as useless for anything except storing coal and wool. In 1933, Brunel's second great ship was towed into Sparrow Cove and left to rust.
Even when she was a derelict in the Falkland Islands, people knew that she was significant and should be valued. As a survivor of the transitional phase between wooden technology and modern steel technology, in that she's a metal-hulled vessel, She's also a survivor of the Victorian mass immigration movement. She's one of 2 surviving craft that took troops to the Crimean War. As far as we know, she's the only surviving troop ship that took troops to the Indian Mutiny. Also, after the Battle of the River Plate in the Second World War, HMS Exeter, which was quite badly damaged, came down to the Falkland Islands and is reputed to have repaired some damage using plate from the SS Great Britain.
Of course, that was not the end of the story. In 1970, the Great Britain undertook yet another epic ocean voyage, this time as a result of a rescue attempt to save her remains. The sad iron hulk was towed back 3,000 miles from the Falklands to her birthplace in Bristol. This was the first time Brunel's SS Great Britain had passed under his suspension bridge. That was not completed until 21 years after the ship's launch. For over 30 years, she's had pride of place here. A massive programme began to restore Brunel's only remaining ship to something like her former glory. It seemed a hopeless task, but slowly the rotting hulk was repaired and repainted, and her former grace and fine lines began to emerge. However, now it seems some of the conservation work may not be working too well.
Over the years, we've learned that the chlorides which are causing the corrosion in the ironwork is so deep-seated that no matter how much you clean it and repaint it, it still carries on corroding. So what we're doing now is we're doing a different method of conservation. We're going to treat the ship like she's an amazing, great big museum artefact, and we're effectively going to put her into her own little museum box, if you like. So we're going to put a glass plate over the top of the dry dock, which effectively seals in the lower part of the hull. That way we can then dry the environment around it, and that then halts the corrosion. We're going to do something similar inside. We're going to put an air handling unit, so that again dehumidifies the air inside the ship. And the only area that we have to do something different on is the top side here, you can see behind me, where we will be cleaning it and repainting it. But in that area, because it was above the waterline, the chlorides are not quite such a big problem. And we've got some very specialist conservators working on it who are going to very, very carefully clean it, very sensitively repatch and then repaint it. And you will see that that will hopefully keep the ship for another 100 years in the condition she is in now. Some work will have to be done, no doubt. We'll have to touch up the paintwork, we'll have to do odds and ends of things, but this major development should be the last major development for a long time.
The current work is beginning to bear fruit. The glass water-covered floor will give the impression that she's once more afloat. A number of historic spaces on board are being rebuilt. The captain's cabin and berth, a stewardess's cabin, and a refurbished ladies' boudoir. We'll see what it was like for those who travelled steerage. And here's a preview of the gilding work being applied to the carvings on her stern. This is real gold leaf. The SS Great Britain has had a checkered career, marked by triumph and failure, as did her designer, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Bristol is proud of his great ship. In the same way, the city is proud of that other Brunel icon, the Clifton Suspension Bridge. Before I continue my journey into the West Country, I've been promised to look around the newly discovered chambers inside the abutments supporting the towers.
Oh, blimey! Goodness gracious me!
What I found inside amazed me.
Richard is back on the trail of the Little Giant next Saturday evening at 7:30. After the break, the conclusion of the history of the war against the French, assessing how Britain and the Allies triumphed at Waterloo and how our modern world was hammered out on the anvil of conflict.
The phone lines are now open. To vote, call 0901 121 22. Then for Nikki and Beverley, add 01. For Penny and Kurt,